My father, William, sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, his left hand trembling from Parkinson's, but his voice still carrying the full weight of his authority as he ordered me to move back into my old room and take care of him full time. He openly admitted that he had lied to the attorney, telling them I was unlikely to survive, in order to take $200,000 from my grandfather's estate. William felt no remorse. He shouted across the dinner table that it was family money and that I had a responsibility to my brother. I did not argue. I slowly set my phone down on the polished wood surface, my fingertip dragging lightly along the edge of the screen. I stared at the visitor log file open in front of me, where 36 rounds of chemotherapy were listed with the next of kin column completely blank. A cold record of every session he had let me go through alone. William began to cry, frightened by his illness and the loneliness waiting for him. But he did not know that I had not come back to be his caretaker. He had no idea that I had used my investment company to quietly purchase the debt on Derek's house. I was holding his future in my hands. He just did not know it yet. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story hits close to home. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I would love to know where you are listening from. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. William's shadow still stretched across the mahogany, cutting through the thin yellow light from the chandelier overhead. I shifted my elbow against the wood and felt the dry skin of my forearm catch on the polished surface, a small friction that pulled me back into my body and out of the silence his offer had left hanging in the room. He had used the word obligation. He had said it the way he said most things, evenly, like he was reading a figure off a balance sheet, and the word was still there in the air between us, not quite settled. The smell of old wood and candle wax from that table always did this to me. It pulled me somewhere else before I could stop it. I was 10 years old. The kitchen in my grandfather's house faced west, and by late afternoon the light through the frosted glass panes turned the color of honey, thick and slow. My grandfather's hand was around mine, not holding it exactly, just present. The rough skin of his knuckles against my palm, the calluses on his fingertips guiding the brush without pressure. He was showing me how to load watercolor without drowning the bristles. The water in the ceramic dish was already faintly blue. He didn't say much while he taught. He would watch what I was doing and then make a small adjustment, a nudge of the wrist, and the line would come out different, better. He smelled like pipe tobacco and old pine, and every breath he took was slow and even, and I remember thinking that nothing in the world could reach me inside that sound. I picked up a ginger snap from the plate on the counter. It was still warm. The powdered sugar came off on my fingertip, and I stood there eating it while he poured tea into a white cup with a rim so thin you could see light through it. The clock on the wall ticked. The copper kettle on the stove hummed low. My feet didn't reach the floor from the wooden stool, so I let them hang. And the whole afternoon felt like something I could hold in both hands without spilling. The crystal glass left my fingers before I had decided to let it go. William had reached across the table and taken it. His hand was fast for a man whose left hand trembled from Parkinson's, the right one still moving the way it always had, precise and certain. The crystal clicked against the mahogany and the sound was clean and sharp, and it cut through everything. He looked at the skin on the back of my hand for a moment, the patches that had peeled from the last round of treatment, and then he pushed the dirty plate toward me with one short movement. "Megan wants that set," he said. "Put it down before you drop it." He had already looked away by the time I registered the words. I pulled my hands into my lap and pressed my palms against my thighs through the fabric of my sweater. The wool was rough and slightly stiff from washing, and the texture against my fingertips gave me something to concentrate on. William had turned to Derek, who was cutting his steak without looking up. William began tapping his family signet ring against the edge of the table, a slow, measured rhythm, the same one he used when he was waiting for someone to finish a sentence he had already decided was wrong. I let my shoulders drop and my head lower slightly, enough that my hair fell forward and covered part of my face. I had learned long ago how to make myself take up less room at that table. The adjustment was automatic. I didn't decide to do it any more than I decided to breathe. I pressed my thumbnail into the underside of the chair seat, right at the edge where there was a small scratch I had known since I was 12. The sharp point of the wood grain bit lightly into the skin, and I focused on that, using the small sensation to keep myself from moving, from reacting, from letting anything cross my face that William could read. I counted the threads on the hem of the tablecloth. I counted my own heartbeats, which were going faster than they should have been. I regulated my breathing down to something shallow and quiet. Then I reached up and touched the silver chain at my collarbone. My grandfather had given me the pendant on the chain, a small piece of green stone, smooth from years of being turned in a palm. I rotated it with 2 fingers until the warmth from my skin had transferred into the metal. I let out one slow breath. The portrait of the family hung on the wall behind William's shoulder, and I looked at it without really seeing it. I had been looking at William the way you look at something you are trying to understand from the outside, cataloging the movements, noting the patterns, the way he held his fork, the way he glanced at Derek before he spoke, the way the ring tapped faster when he was running out of patience with a situation he thought he controlled. The warmth of my grandfather's hand around mine and the cold snap of the crystal being taken from my fingers were not 2 separate memories. They were the same measurement, 2 points on the same line, and the distance between them was the exact length of what had been lost. I had been making myself small inside this house since long before the diagnosis. The cancer had not taught me how to disappear. I had already known. But the request to move back into my old room was not a request. I had understood that even as William was still speaking, it was the visible edge of something larger, and Derek's new car keys were sitting on the television cabinet across the room, and William was smiling the particular smile he used when he believed a transaction had already been completed. I stood and picked up the stack of dirty dishes, and I carried them to the kitchen, and I began to understand how much of this I had not yet seen. The kitchen light was the fluorescent kind, the long tubes that hum at a frequency you stop noticing until you have been under them for 20 minutes, and then you cannot stop noticing it. It flattened everything, the grease on the stovetop, the water rings on the counter, the look of my own hands when I turned on the faucet and ran cold water over them. From the living room, Derek's laugh came through the wall in bursts, loose and easy, the laugh of someone who had just been handed something and was already comfortable with the weight of it. I gripped the top of the garbage bag and pulled. The bag was heavy, wine bottles mostly, 2 of them from the good rack that William kept for company, and I had to use both hands and lean my weight back to break the suction of the plastic against the bin. The port below my collarbone where the infusion line went in had been tender since Tuesday. I pressed my lips together and got the bag up and dragged it across the marble floor. It left a wet streak. I did not stop to wipe it up yet. In the living room, Derek lay across the leather sofa with his feet on the coffee table. His socks were white. His Rolex was on the table next to a half-open pizza box, and the television was showing a soccer match at a volume that suggested Derek was the only person in the building. He held a beer can loosely in one hand, and when the play on the screen shifted, he reached over without looking and tossed a crumpled paper napkin onto the floor next to the chair leg. It landed near a second one he had dropped earlier. He did not glance toward the kitchen. He did not register the sound of the garbage bag being dragged across the floor or the sound of my breathing, which was harder than it should have been for the task. I left the bag by the back door and went back to the sink. William came into the living room from the hallway. He was moving slowly. The Parkinson's had been affecting his gait for the past year, a slight unevenness on the left side, but he came in and stood near Derek. And I watched through the kitchen doorway as he drew a green folder from under his arm and set it on the coffee table next to the Rolex. His left hand rested on Derek's shoulder briefly. The right hand opened the folder and pushed it toward Derek with 2 fingers. Derek sat up. His face changed. He lifted the first page and his eyes moved across it quickly, and then he looked up at William, and William was already nodding. I turned back to the sink. The folder was for the guest house. I knew the guest house. It sat at the back of the property, a separate structure with its own entrance, its own light, and 2 windows that faced north. My grandfather had used it as a studio. He had promised it to me the last time I saw him clearly, before the dementia took the clarity out of his sentences. He had said that room has good light. He had meant it for me. I had been 27 years old, and I had nodded and not said anything about it because it felt like the kind of thing that didn't need to be said. I was still standing at the sink with a wet rag in my hand when William turned toward the garage and gestured with his chin toward the far corner. The movement was brief and dismissive, the way you might indicate where to put a box of things you haven't gotten around to throwing out. He said something to Derek about using the garage space as an interim arrangement, and Derek tilted his head at the folder again, and neither of them looked in my direction. The rag dripped onto the floor. I bent down and picked up Derek's paper napkins from the living room floor, both of them, and carried them to the trash. I wiped down the coffee table where Derek had set his beer can. I moved to the dining room and began clearing the remaining plates. The motions were practiced: reach, lift, stack, carry, and I executed them without variance, without pausing, without any shift in the speed of my movements that would indicate I had noticed what had just happened 6 feet away from me. The dishwater was too hot, and it was making my hands ache. I kept washing. This was the version of me that existed inside this house. There was another version, the one who had built a career in Boston, who managed junior designers and ran client presentations and made decisions about projects that had more moving parts than this family could conceive of. That version stood straight. That version had opinions and stated them in rooms where people wrote them down. Inside this house, I did not straighten all the way. It was not a choice I made consciously. It was a calibration that happened at the door, the same way your eyes adjust when you walk from bright sunlight into a dim room. You do not decide to see differently. You just do. I stacked the last of the dishes in the rack, turned off the faucet, and dried my hands carefully on the dish towel. My hands looked worse under the fluorescent light than they did anywhere else, the skin around the knuckles still peeling slightly, the nails still thinner than they had been before treatment started. I looked at them for a moment and then folded the towel over the oven handle. The clock on the kitchen wall read 11. Derek and William were still talking in the living room, their voices overlapping now, animated with the energy of men who have just decided something. I did not have to hear the words. I knew what the folder meant. I knew what the gesture toward the garage meant. And I knew that none of it was impulsive, because William did not make impulsive decisions about property, which meant the folder had been prepared in advance, which meant a conversation had already happened before tonight, which meant that whatever I was seeing was not the beginning of anything. Tomorrow morning I was supposed to ride with William to the oncology center. 40 minutes in the Volvo, the two of us. Nowhere to go and no way to leave. And I already knew exactly what he did with 40 minutes and a captive seat. The Volvo smelled like new leather and synthetic pine from a disc air freshener clipped to the vent. William had bought the car 8 months ago, which was 4 months after I had come home to recover from round 22. He had shown it to me the first weekend, the way he showed me things he was proud of. A slow walk around the exterior, a few comments about the safety rating. Nothing directed at me exactly, just aimed in my general direction. I had said it looked good. He had nodded like I had confirmed something he already knew. I was in the passenger seat with my bag on my lap and my shoulder pressed slightly into the door. I had learned the geometry of riding with William over the years. If I angled myself toward the window and kept my hands in my lap, the space between us read as neutral. It did not invite conversation. It did not provoke anything. It was a posture I had refined over years of car trips, graduation ceremonies, holiday gatherings, the drive to my grandfather's funeral, all of it logged in the same position, one shoulder to the glass, eyes forward, waiting. William drove in bursts, accelerating and then braking harder than necessary. Each stop pressed the seatbelt across the infusion port, and I exhaled slowly through my nose each time without making a sound. The radio was on, something orchestral that I did not recognize, the volume low enough to be irritating without being loud enough to block anything. He adjusted the rearview mirror twice in the first 10 minutes. He was not adjusting it to see the road. I watched a street sign pass, then a utility pole. I started counting them. He turned off the radio. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that precedes a prepared statement, and I knew it the way you know weather, not from seeing it, but from what the air does before it arrives. He hit the left side of the steering wheel with his palm, the ring connecting with the leather in one sharp strike. His right hand stayed on the wheel. Your mother and I gave up everything. His voice was the voice he used for conversations he intended to win, measured, certain. A voice that did not ask questions because it had already decided the answers. Everything we had, we put into this family, into your education, into making sure you had what you needed to build a life. The words were arranged in an order I had heard variations of before, but this iteration was building toward something. And now, when your father is ill, when this family needs you to step up and contribute, you're telling me that the money from your grandfather's estate is yours alone, to spend on treatments. He let the last word sit there without anything after it. Then, I need you to think about what you're asking us to believe, that you'd use $200,000 on care that your own doctors have told us may not work, when Derek needs help keeping the house. He stopped himself, which was unusual. William did not often stop himself mid-sentence. He glanced at the road, then back at the mirror. I adjusted the headscarf with 2 fingers, just a small straightening at the temple. I kept my breathing where it was, slow, nasal, producing no sound. My jaw was loose. My shoulders were where I had placed them. I was watching his hands. Right hand tight on the wheel, left hand on his thigh, trembling in its usual rhythm. He was hitting the ring against his knee now, a slower pattern than the one he used at the table. Your doctor said themselves it was unlikely to work, he continued, his voice dropping into something softer, which was worse. The soft voice was the one he used when he had already— I had heard cleaner versions from him before. 12 minutes to the hospital. I read the figure off the dashboard before he had turned the GPS on. I knew the route. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. Then I looked at the road. The trees on the median had lost most of their leaves, and the bare branches were the kind of gray that made everything around them look colorless. I turned the silver ring on my right forefinger slowly, my grandfather's, too large for me, worn down at the shank from decades of use. The metal was cold and then warm, and then cold again when I stopped turning it. I used the sensation the way I had used the scratch on the chair 2 nights before. One clear physical point against which to place myself. I did not respond to what William had said. I did not shift my weight or alter my expression. I kept my face at a particular flatness, not blank, which would have read as insolence, but neutral in a way that he could interpret as processing. He needed to believe I was still inside the conversation. I was not. I was in a different part of my mind, the part that had been taking notes for a long time, building a record of patterns and timestamps, assembling something that would eventually be useful. He pulled into the hospital parking structure and took a ticket from the machine. The bar lifted. He drove slowly down the ramp without speaking again. He believed the silence meant he had made his point. He stopped in a space near the elevator and sat there for a moment after he cut the engine, both hands on the steering wheel. I only ask, he said, because I love you. He said it to the windshield. I got out of the car, closed the door, and walked into the hospital alone. William's Volvo was gone before I reached the column. I had turned back once, instinctively. The way you turn when you expect someone to still be there, and the space at the curb was empty. The exhaust was still thinning in the cold air. I put my hand on the concrete pillar and stood there for a moment, letting the cold move through my coat and into my shoulders. The nausea had been building since the parking structure. By the time the nurse attached the line to the port, it had settled into something dense and low in my chest, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply occupies the space and waits. I lay on the infusion bed and looked at the drip bag and counted the drops, because counting them gave me a fixed point, and a fixed point was what I needed. 36 sessions. I knew the count the way I knew my own address. I reached for my phone on the side table. My arm trembled slightly with the effort. I found William's name and pressed call. 3 rings. Then the voicemail prompt, his recorded voice, formal and brief, the name and a request to leave a message. I ended the call and tried again. Same result. I put the phone down on the bed beside me and looked at the ceiling, which was the standard drop-tile ceiling common to every hospital room I had ever been in, uniformly lit and impersonal. I had spent a significant portion of the last 2 years looking at ceilings in rooms like this one. I was familiar with their specific quality of offering nothing back. The phone screen lit up. A text. I'm sleeping. Don't make this into something. Call the nurse. You're an adult. I read it twice. The words did not rearrange themselves the second time. I set the phone face down on the mattress and turned onto my side, pulling my knees up slowly, the infusion line running above me and over the side rail in a small arc. The metal rail was cold against my forehead when I pressed my face to it. I stayed there. My shoulders were doing something I usually did not allow them to do, moving in small rhythms that I kept as quiet as I could, no sound coming out, just the movement. The machine next to me continued beeping its single note at regular intervals, patient and indifferent. At some point, my knees found the floor. I was not fully aware of deciding this. My hands were in the bedsheet and the floor was cold through the thin socks the hospital provided, and I was down on both knees with my forehead against the mattress, and I let myself stay there. The tears went straight down because of the angle, hitting the floor in a way I could hear very faintly. I did not try to stop them. There was no one in the room. There was no one coming to the room. The visitor log had 36 entries, and the column beside my name on each one was blank, and this was the 37th time in a building like this, and the text message was still on my phone, and my father was sleeping. I let myself have however long that was. Then I lifted my head. I used the mattress to get back up, moved to the small basin at the wall, and ran cold water with both hands and pushed it against my face several times. I dried my face with the paper towel from the dispenser, doing the job properly, getting the moisture from the corners of my eyes and along the jaw. I looked into the small mirror above the basin. My eyes were red. They would not be red by the time I left the building. I ran more cold water and did it again, and stood there until the redness was just a slight dullness, nothing that anyone would notice unless they were looking for it. I picked my phone up off the mattress and deleted William's text. I turned the phone off completely, the screen going dark with a brief vibration in my palm. I straightened my headscarf. I straightened my collar. I stood with both feet flat on the floor and looked at myself in the mirror again until I recognized the expression I was looking for, not composed exactly, but level, ready to think. Before I tell you what I found when I went back, if any part of this has found you somewhere you recognize, somewhere quiet and alone, and waiting for a call that isn't coming, press the like button so I know you're here with me. And if you've ever had to dry your own face and stand back up, not because you were strong but because you simply had no other option, I'd like you to tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me tell you what I did when the sun came up. I left the hospital before the first shift change. I had a list of 3 things I needed to find, and I knew exactly where 2 of them were. The study door was not fully closed. It never was. William's arthritic left hand had difficulty with the latch, and he had stopped bothering with it unless he had guests. The light from the desk lamp made a thin line on the hallway floor. I stood at the edge of that line for a moment, listening to the rest of the house. The heat system was running. Nothing else. I went in. The room smelled the way it always had. Old paper, furniture polish, a faint trace of the pipe tobacco my grandfather had smoked, which the wood had absorbed over decades, and still gave back when the room was warm. The mahogany filing cabinet stood along the left wall. The desk was in the center. I moved to the desk first because William kept the things he was actively using in the desk and the things he wanted to forget about in the cabinets. The small paperclip took 30 seconds. I had watched a locksmith open a cabinet like this one 3 years ago during a studio relocation in Boston, and I had paid attention because I paid attention to most things. The bottom drawer released with a soft click. Inside, 4 brown accordion folders, a rolled set of architectural drawings that probably predated me, and a slim leather binder that was newer than anything else in the drawer. I recognized the leather. It was the kind William used for documents he intended to present. I opened it. My own name was on the first page. Below it, the trust account number from my grandfather's estate. Below that, a letter on legal stationery with the firm's watermark dated 21 months ago, the 3rd month of my treatment, stating that the named beneficiary had been assessed by 2 attending physicians as being of diminished capacity and unlikely to achieve recovery sufficient to manage assets. The signatures at the bottom were a physician's name I did not recognize, and William's own signature, written in his formal script, the one he used when he wanted the writing to look deliberate. $200,000. Transfer authorized pending legal confirmation. Recipient account, Derek R. Atwood. I took out my phone. I turned off the flash. I photographed every page, 13 pages total, front and back, holding the phone level and steady over each one. My hands did not shake. I placed each page back in the exact orientation it had been in, closed the binder, returned it to the drawer, and relocked it with the same paperclip in the same sequence. I did not touch the surface of the desk. I backed out of the room and pulled the door back to the precise angle it had been at when I entered. 3 days later, I was sitting across from Harper at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. She had chosen a table at the back. She was already there when I arrived, a cup of coffee in front of her, both hands around it. She was 60 and had been a charge nurse for 22 years, the kind of person who had watched enough families come and go through the oncology ward to have developed a particular quality of stillness. She did not ask me how I was feeling. She had never done that. She always asked what I needed. She slid the blue binder across the table. "Official visitor log," she said. 2 years. She watched me open it. "There's no signature from him in there. Not a single one." She placed her hand on mine briefly, warm, dry, deliberate, and then withdrew it. "Use it when it's time." I closed the binder and put it into the interior pocket of my bag. I felt its weight settle against my ribs. Outside, the leaves on the sidewalk were frozen into the ground from the week's temperatures. I walked back toward my car with the binder against my ribs and the photographs on my phone, and 13 pages of documentation of what had been done while I was on an infusion table counting drip drops, and no one was signing their name in any column anywhere. The air was sharp and dry. My breath came out in small clouds that disappeared before I had taken another step. That evening, I sat in the living room with a basket of yarn on my lap and knitted, while William told Derek about the plans for the interior renovation. He was animated in the way he became when he believed a project was already settled. He described fixtures. He described the square footage of the main room. He used the phrase, "your office," 6 times, without once looking toward where I was sitting. I made each stitch carefully, counting them under my breath, and I nodded whenever there was a pause in his speech. And I poured his tea when his cup was empty, and I did not let anything show on my face for 2 solid hours. The dinner for Derek and Megan's anniversary was set for the following evening. William had been mentioning it all week with the particular energy he reserved for occasions he intended to use. He had not said what he intended to use it for. He didn't need to. I had read the binder. I knew what he had been building toward. What he did not know was that I had read it, and that Harper's visitor log was in the inside pocket of the bag I intended to bring to that dinner, and that I had no intention of signing anything at that table. He sat in his chair, comfortable and unhurried, and told his son about the paint colors he had already chosen for a room that had never belonged to Derek, and I knitted another row, and the clock on the mantel moved forward in its ordinary way, and by the time I went upstairs I had already decided exactly how the following evening would end. The Thanksgiving table had been set with the white linen cloth and the silver candlesticks and the good crystal. The chandelier was dimmed to its warmer setting, and from outside the dining room it might have looked like any other family dinner. The centerpiece, the wine already poured, the plates arranged with care. I came in and sat at my usual seat at the corner of the table, the one that placed me adjacent to the serving area, which was practical if you were the person who would be getting up for things. I set my bag on the floor beside my chair, strap looped once around the chair leg. William was at the head. He had dressed for the occasion, his good jacket, the watch he kept for gatherings. His left hand rested on the tablecloth and trembled in its steady pattern. His right hand was perfectly still on the arm of his chair. Derek was to his left, Megan across from Derek, two of William's golf acquaintances and their wives filling the remaining seats. Everyone had been given wine. The room had the particular warmth of a space that has been deliberately made comfortable in order to make something else easier. William reached across the table and set turkey breast on my plate himself. He did it slowly, using the serving fork with care. Then he laid his left hand over mine, the trembling one, and pressed it lightly. He began to speak in a lower register, his voice carrying the warmth he used for stories about when Derek and I were children. He mentioned a trip we had all taken to the lake house. He mentioned the summers. He said that family was what held people together when everything else fell away, and he said it with his hand still over mine, and his eyes had a particular softness in them that I had seen before in contexts like this one, the softness that appeared before a request. I looked at the turkey breast on my plate. I kept my hand where it was. I did not move toward him or away from him. His palm was dry and cool over the back of my hand, and I registered the sensation the same way I would have registered the temperature of a surface I was checking before placing something on it. He straightened. His hand came back to his side. He refilled my wine glass, slowly, watching the level. He told the acquaintances at the other end of the table that I was doing wonderfully, that I was a fighter, that the whole family was proud. Someone made a pleasant noise. Derek smiled at Megan. I cut the turkey breast into even pieces. Then William reached beneath his chair and brought up the black leather folder. He set it to my right and opened it to the marked page in a single motion. The gold pen came from his inside jacket pocket. He placed it parallel to the edge of the folder, perpendicular to the red X. His voice did not change register. He kept the same measured, almost conversational tone as he explained that the document was a power of attorney for asset management, that it would allow the family to consolidate resources during a difficult period, that the trust funds would be redirected to stabilize the mortgage on the property, and that it would ensure my own continued access to care in a managed and appropriate way. He said the words, "for your protection," twice. Derek was not eating anymore. He had his forearms on the table, weight forward, watching my hands. The clock in the hallway was audible in the way it was only audible when the room had gotten very quiet. I looked at the red X. I looked at the pen. I looked at the breakdown of terms on the page below it, which redirected $200,000 into an account under Derek's name. I did not reach for the pen. The temperature in William's expression dropped in a way that happened faster than I expected, even though I had been expecting it. He leaned forward, and his shadow extended across my portion of the table. His voice did not rise. It never rose immediately. It went colder first, and the coldness was a kind of pressure, like a hand flat against a door. He told me that he had spent 2 years managing the burden of my illness on this family. He told me that Derek had a family to support, and that it was a matter of basic decency for me to understand my responsibilities in this moment. He told me that if I could not find it in myself to prioritize the family's needs over my own, and here he paused, his ring knocking once against the table, then he would need to reconsider whether his continued support of my treatment was something the family could sustain. He said, "I wish I didn't have to say this to you, Camille. I wish you understood without being told." I looked at the document. Then I reached down and closed my hand around the strap of my bag. I lifted the gold pen from the table with my right hand and held it level above the signature line. The nib was 0.5 centimeter from the paper. William exhaled. A small, quiet release of held breath. Derek's shoulders dropped a fraction. I kept the pen where it was, suspended, and with my left hand I drew the blue folder out of my bag and placed it on the tablecloth, flat, to the right of William's document. I set my palm on top of it and looked at William. His eyes moved from my face to the folder and back to my face, and something in his expression changed in a way that had nothing to do with the Parkinsons. I placed the pen down on the table, parallel to where it had been before, and I opened the folder. I did not say anything at first. I turned to the first page of the visitor log and smoothed the paper flat with one hand, the gesture ordinary, unhurried, the kind of thing you might do before reading a menu. The header was printed in the hospital's standard font. Patient visitor record, 2 years of entries, columns for date, time, relationship, and signature. I moved the folder to the center of the table so that the light from the chandelier fell directly across the print. My name was in the top corner of every page. The signature column beside it was empty. Page after page, the same. A date, a time, a notation that the patient had arrived for infusion, and then a clean white column where a name was supposed to be. I said, quietly and without inflection, that I had been treated 36 times in 24 months. I said that the document on my left, the one William had brought to the table tonight, contained a physician's letter stating that I was of diminished capacity and unlikely to recover. I said the letter was dated 14 months ago and bore William's signature. I said that the account number listed as the receiving destination for the trust funds was the same account number attached to the mortgage on Derek's house, which I had verified through the county property records, which are public. William stood up. He did it fast. The chair pushed back and caught on the rug and tilted but did not fall. His left hand came down on the table and the crystal glasses jumped and rang against each other in a sharp, bright cascade of sound. His face had changed quickly. The color came into it fast. The veins at his temple surfaced. His voice, when it came, was no longer the measured instrument he had spent the evening calibrating. "You are the most selfish person I have ever raised," he said. The words came out between his teeth. "You would take that money to your grave. You would take everything this family has built and put it in the ground with you." His arm swung toward me, index finger extended, the hand shaking now not just from the Parkinsons. "I wish," he said, and he stopped himself for half a second, and in that half second I could see him make the decision to say it anyway. "I wish you had died after the first round, before you cost us all of this." The room was entirely silent for a moment after he said it. The kind of silence that happens when something is said that cannot be taken back, and everyone in the room understands this simultaneously. I sat with my hands flat on the blue folder and looked at him. Derek had the leather binder in his hands. He was looking at the cover of it rather than at William or at me, and his fingers were bending the bottom corner back and forth in a small, repetitive motion. Megan had leaned back in her chair. The two acquaintances from the golf club were both looking at the tablecloth. I said, still in the same register, that the letter in the binder had been submitted to a probate attorney I had retained 4 weeks ago. that copies of the property record and the trust fund transfer authorization had been filed with that attorney, that the 48-hour deadline on the sale paperwork William had been preparing had passed at 9 that morning because the counterparty in the transaction, whom I had contacted directly through my investment portfolio, had been informed that the seller did not have clear authorization to proceed. William said something else. I did not register the individual words. He was still forward over the table, and his voice had gone high and uneven in a way I had never heard from him, a frequency that suggested the internal structure he used to maintain his authority was no longer bearing the weight he was putting on it. Derek set the binder down. He pushed his chair back from the table by about 1.5 feet, not standing, just creating separation. One of the golf acquaintances said something quietly to his wife. They both rose. I collected the visitor log pages carefully, restacking them in order. I closed the folder. I stood up and put my coat on, one sleeve at a time. When I passed Megan's chair, I stopped and rested my hand briefly on her shoulder. Just the weight of it. And she looked up at me with an expression I recognized. Not surprise exactly, more the look of someone who has been reading a book and finally reached the page where the thing they had suspected is confirmed. I did not say anything to her. I did not need to. The front door was heavy. I opened it with one hand and stepped through and pulled it closed behind me without letting it slam. The cold came in immediately, the kind of cold that clears your sinuses and makes your eyes water slightly at the outer edges. William's voice was still audible through the door for 3 or 4 seconds, and then it wasn't. I walked to my car. The street was dark except for the lamp at the corner, which cast a cone of pale yellow light onto the wet pavement. I unlocked the car and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting it. My hands were in my lap. They were not shaking. They had not been shaking at the table either, and I noted this with the detached quality I had developed for noticing things about my own body over the past 2 years. I thought about what William had said, the particular sentence, the specific words he had chosen, and then I put it in the same place I had been putting things for a long time. The place where I kept the facts of this situation separate from any response to them. I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the house was lit from inside, every window showing. I watched it for a moment and then I backed out of the driveway and drove. 3 weeks passed. The newspaper that covered the county's legal notices ran the Atwood Trust litigation in its second section, between a rezoning dispute and an estate auction. The notice was 4 sentences. I read it once in my apartment in Boston, over coffee, and then folded the paper and left it on the kitchen counter and went to work. William was in a rental. I knew this because Harper mentioned it, not as gossip, but as a fact she thought I should have, in the same way she had thought I should have the visitor log. She said he had taken a 1-bedroom in a complex off Route 9, the kind of building with a management office that smelled like industrial cleaner and a parking lot that flooded when it rained hard. He had tried to attend the last meeting of his club and had been asked to send his regrets, which in that community was a way of saying something without saying it. The Rolex was gone from Derek's wrist. Derek's car had not been on the road in 2 weeks. At the golf club, the members who had been in William's circle for years quietly removed him from the active roster. They did not hold a meeting. They did not send a letter. They simply adjusted, the way water adjusts around an object that has been removed. His personal effects were boxed and left at the rear entrance. A woman named Patricia, who had called William 3 times in the week after Thanksgiving, did not call again. I was standing at my kitchen window with a mug of tea when the buzzer sounded. I pressed the intercom. Megan's voice came through, small and slightly distorted by the speaker. I let her up. She was at the door with a flat tin, the kind you get at holiday markets with cookies stacked inside on wax paper. She was not wearing the earrings she usually wore. Her coat was a plain wool one I had not seen before. She held the tin with both hands and did not come fully into the doorframe until I stepped back to invite her in. She took her coat off and looked at the space of my apartment, the drafting table, the paintings on the wall, the light coming in off the river, with the look of someone encountering a room that doesn't match the description they had been given. I poured water for both of us. We sat in the 2 chairs near the window. She set an envelope on the table between us. "I filed the divorce papers on Monday," she said. She kept her eyes on the middle distance. "He was in the room when your father's attorney explained those documents. He didn't say anything." She paused. "He didn't say anything to me either." She looked at her hands. She moved the envelope closer to me. "I worked with your attorney's office. There's a summary in there. The trust funds should be reassigned within 60 days. She finally looked at me directly. She looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep. I slid the envelope to my side of the table without opening it. I refilled her water glass. She was pressing her thumbs against the outside of the warm mug, and I recognized the gesture because I had done the same thing in rooms where I needed to stay level. I did not tell her it was all right. It was not all right. I did not tell her that none of it was her fault. Some of it was. I did not say either of those things because they were not what she had come for. She had come to put something down, and I understood that. So I let her put it down. I went to the desk and got my grandfather's pen, the one from his study, which I had taken the night I photographed the documents, along with one other thing I had needed, and I signed the papers in the envelope with my own name in full, the letters unhurried and even, the nib moving cleanly across the page. I put the pen in my breast pocket afterward, not on the desk. When Megan left, an hour later, she paused at the door and looked back at the room once more. She seemed to find something of it, or near enough to it, because her shoulders had come down from where they had been when she arrived. I went to the window. The Charles was dark and running fast below the embankment, the surface catching light in brief flashes as it moved. The tin of cookies was on the counter, and I opened it and ate one standing there, looking at the river. It tasted like butter and orange zest, simple and good. I ate a second one. The filing cabinet in my study had one new folder in it now, behind the medical records. I had labeled it in my own hand, the same way I labeled everything in my studio. Clearly, without abbreviation. The folder contained 23 pages. The pen was back in my breast pocket. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning to come down. Not the heavy kind, just the preliminary kind, the kind that settles on cold surfaces and disappears from warm ones and makes everything slightly quieter than it was before. 6 months. The light in Boston in late May comes in from the east in the morning and moves across the floor of the studio slowly enough that you can track it if you are paying attention. I had set up the drafting table at the far wall, under the good window, and in the mornings the light arrived at the table edge around 8:15 and was fully across the work surface by 9. I had started organizing my mornings around this. My hair had come back in the way it does after treatment, soft at first, a different texture than before, growing in close to the scalp, and then thickening gradually over the months. I had stopped checking it every morning. I still touched it sometimes when I was thinking, running my palm from the crown down to the nape, not out of anxiety but out of habit, the way you check a healed bone in cold weather. It was there. It was growing. The cancer markers from the last scan were stable, which in oncology language meant something specific and useful. I took my medications in the morning with coffee and did not count them as carefully as I once had. The corkboard above the drafting table had a watercolor tacked to the center of it, the piece I had finished in February, the first one I had completed since before the 3rd round of treatment. It was not especially good. The composition was off in the lower left quadrant, and I had overworked the water in the foreground. I left it there anyway, because it was finished, and a finished, imperfect thing has a quality that an unfinished one doesn't. My grandfather's brush was in the jar of clean water on the table. I had been using it again since March. The bristles had softened over the years into something between precise and loose, and you had to adjust for it. Less pressure, wider movements, but the adjustment was easy now that I was used to it. His photograph was on the shelf next to the window, standing beside the pot of yellow tulips I replaced every 2 weeks. I had framed it in oak because that was the wood he preferred, and the afternoon light hit the silver in the photograph at an angle that made it look almost warm. The phone lit up on the table beside the water jar. William's name. I watched it ring without touching it. The ringtone went through its full cycle, 4 rings, and then silence, and then the small vibration that meant a voicemail had been left. I did not feel my chest tighten, or my hands change their position on the table. I felt something more like recognition. The call was a data point in an ongoing record, not a crisis. I picked up the phone after the notification cleared and turned it face down on the table. I did not block the number. I also did not listen to the message. I turned back to the watercolor in progress on the drafting table. I had been working on a blue-gray wash for the background, trying to achieve the color of the sky in my grandfather's kitchen window at the particular time of afternoon, when the light was neither gold nor neutral, but something between. I had mixed the wash 3 times already. The third attempt was closer. I loaded the brush and pulled the color across the wet paper in one slow movement, watching the edge of it feather at the contact point. The buzzer sounded at 11. Megan was at the door with a baking tin and a jacket the color of sage, new, a good color on her. She had cut her hair shorter in the interim, and she carried herself differently. Something in the way the weight had redistributed itself across her shoulders. We had met 3 times since December. Each time was easier than the one before, not because the past had become less accurate, but because we were both moving forward through it at a similar pace, and pacing matters when you are walking with someone through something difficult. She set the tin on the kitchen counter and came to look at the painting. She studied it for a moment with the specific attention of someone who is genuinely looking rather than performing interest. "The edges," she said, pointing to where the wash met the dry paper. "Is that what you were going for?" "Not exactly," I said. "But it works." She sat at the table and I made 2 cups of chamomile and we drank them near the window while the painting dried. She was taking a course at the extension school. Something in design history, which she had wanted to do for years and had not done for reasons that no longer applied. She talked about it without hurrying, with the particular pleasure of someone describing something that is genuinely theirs. I listened. I put my feet up on the second chair. At some point she picked up one of the spare brushes from the jar and turned it in her fingers. "Could I?" she said. I set a fresh piece of paper in front of her, and she painted a shape that was somewhere between a bird and a leaf, which was exactly what you would paint if you had never painted before, and were following the instinct of the hand without the interference of expectation. I looked at it. It was honest in the way first attempts are honest. I told her the color was good. She left at one with the empty tin and a small sketch I had made of the view from the window, rolled in paper. At the door she turned back once, the way she always did, and this time I understood what she was looking for. She was checking that the room was still here, that it would still be here next week. I nodded, and she smiled, and the door closed. I went back to the drafting table. I picked up my grandfather's brush, loaded it with the blue-gray mix I had adjusted one more time while she was here, and drew a line across the paper. It was the right color. I had been working toward it for 3 months, and now it was right. If you could go back, not to fix it, not to say something that would have changed the ending, but just to find yourself at the lowest point you were ever at, in whatever room that was, whatever hour of the night, whatever surface you were resting your head against, and say one true thing, what would you say? Not to them, to yourself. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if any part of Camille's story found you somewhere you needed to be found tonight, there is another story in the description. A different woman, a different family, the same question underneath all of it. What do you keep, and what do you finally put down? Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one. The painting dried while the afternoon light moved west across the floor of the studio. I did not turn on the overhead light when it dimmed. I sat in the last of the natural light and looked at what I had made, and it was enough. And the door to the room I had come from was exactly as far behind me as I had chosen to leave it. The story of the Atwood family was done. Mine had been going on the whole time.